I welcome you to the discussion we're going to have today on the economies of occupied countries in Europe during World War II. My name is Ross Johnson. I'm a senior scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's my pleasure to chair the meeting today and to introduce our guests and presenters. Let me do that now. On my far right, Professor Hein Kleeman is a graduate in history at the Free University Amsterdam and economics at the University of Rotterdam. His PhD thesis was on entitled Reich and Empire on Dutch trade relations with Germany and Britain in the 30s. Awarded a prize as the best historical thesis by the Royal Highland Academy of Science. Professor Kleeman worked at Utrecht University and the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation. He's now a full professor of economic history at the Erasmus University, Rotterdam. On my immediate right, Dr. Sergei Kudrashov, who was a historian at the Institute of Russian History at the Academy of Sciences. His PhD was on Western studies of the Soviet-German War. He's the founder and longtime editor of the journal Istochnik, which has published many of the key Soviet Politburo and presidential documents from the presidential archives. Editor-in-chief there until 2005, and since then a scientific researcher at the German Historical Institute in Moscow. And one of his projects is digitizing the German wartime documents in the Russian archives, a valuable historical source. They are the co-authors of a book that's just been published that we're discussing today, Occupied Economies, An Economic History of Nazi-Occupied Europe, 1939 to 1945, which, as I understand, explores the, among other things, the dilemma or the contradiction in Nazi German thinking and plans and operations, how much to try to take advantage of the economic potential of the occupied countries in support of the German war machine, and how much to plunder for all kinds of reasons. So we look forward to the discussion today, and I think, Sergei, you're going to begin, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I'll briefly describe the entire project for 10-12 minutes, and then Hein will proceed with PowerPoint presentation. Let me first thank the organizers of this event, Woodrow Wilson Center. We had very good ties with Christian Osterman and his department. For many years, I was involved with various projects of the Cold War International Center of Cold War Studies, and we decided with Christian that it might be a good idea to present the book here in Woodrow Wilson Center. The book itself appeared only a week ago, so it's still unfortunately not on sale in America. But the publishers gave us special flyers which give anyone a substantial reduction if you would like to order it directly from the publisher here in America. But in Europe, I think in Britain, it is already on sale. It's a very big project which was initiated almost 12 years ago by European Science Foundation. And initially, at the very beginning, we all thought that we could easily proceed with that. We just organized people from different countries. Each of them would come, provide a sort of big or long research paper on his own country, economic life of his country during the Nazi occupation. And then we combine their efforts, the results of their work, and the book would appear. It didn't work at all that way. So it took a lot of efforts from various scholars and from all of us, and it appeared to be a very, very tough job. Not only a problem with languages, but problems in interpretations and documents, discrepancy in statistical information, and difficulties to reach some archives. And initially, at some point, Hein and me, thought that the project would die. And we did our best to revive it, and with the help of some scholars, we organized a couple of conferences, tried to unite people, and then eventually decided to finish the book. Hein was a real loco of this project, driving force of it, because he's an economic historian, well known in Europe. I am not an economic historian, so my role was more also of a supportive character. But I did my best to provide this book and to provide all authors of this book, all other contributors who helped us with important materials from Russia. What is important that the Red Army brought a lot of German documents to Moscow, and to a big surprise of us, we realized that a big portion of the archives of the German Economic Ministry, the German Ministry for Economic Affairs, was in Moscow. Actually, many scholars believe that files disappeared forever, and we would never find general statistical information on various countries and so on. And we found all of them in Moscow. It's not a big collection. It's about 13,000 files, but it's a very substantial part of the archive of the German ministry. And we did our best to utilize this archive for this book, and I think it brings a lot of new insights to existing knowledge of this problem. Of course, with historiography on the Second World War, only in 4 languages, English, German, French, and Russian, you've got more than 140,000 titles of books. So it means a scholar needs probably 20 lives to live just to read this literature. So we have to rely on existing historiography, on knowledge of other people, and this is really an international effort. So, and when sometimes you ask what is new, what you are going to say, so we have to combine and rely on previous historiography and other researchers. And what is good, that new materials from German archives, new Russian documents, they do not deny existing knowledge, but they give us a lot of new information, new insights, which allow us to see a more general picture. What is also important about this book, that it's not the book about German economy itself, because the narrative is relatively well known. There are lots of books and lots of information how it was organized, debates among the highest Nazi leaders and so on and so forth. But this is a book about local economies, how Nazi rule impact on local economies. That's what we try to do. Of course, it was very difficult to do. It was very difficult to write it, and Hein knows it very well. And he will stress major conclusions of the book. But we think that this book is an important contribution to the existing knowledge on the Second World War. Doesn't mean that this book close a lot of issues and problems, and after that nothing would happen. No, because Russia still has a lot of secrets, and suddenly we realize that even more archives nowadays exist in the Russian Defense Ministry archive. Well, it's also a very big collection, which never has been studied by the scholars. It's more than 30,000 files. It's more than 2 million pages. And I think what is good that the Russian government actually has decided this year to digitalize the entire archive and put it on the web. It would take probably 3-4 years to do that, but I think that would help many historians to see this war from a different perspective. And now I pass the floor to Hein, and it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you to be here. It's great that you all come. It's an amazing thing. You are writing on a book and in your study, and it's if probably most of you will know, a rather isolated job. And then you come, and people at the other side of the world are interested in it. It's a very amazing thing. You maybe got the impression from what Sergei said that it's a volume of articles. It's not. It's a monography. We use the input from diverse scholars simply because it's impossible to read all languages, but we ended up with a monography, and that was the problem. We had to ask them all to write articles on specific topics and create, on some way or another, not a volume with how it went in France and how it went in Norway and how it went in Serbia, but with as a structured on themes, on problems like how does exploitation go, and what's the consequences for economic life, and what were the consequences for the people living in these countries. And what is the consequences for the economy after the war? That are the type of problems we try to tackle. When you occupy the country, you have a serious problem. Well, what can you do with the economy of that country? You can do two things. You can plunder it, and then you can do one time, and then it's over. Or you can try to get them working. But then the problem is, how do you get it out of the country without paying? When you don't pay these countries, when you don't pay the companies producing, they stop producing. It's quite clear. So in one way or the other, you have to requisite all you want from a country, but pay the individual companies. And that's done all over Europe. And the problem is that both happened. Both happened. There was simply plundering, taking away the factors of production, labor, raw materials, machinery, or even food. What was the most destructive thing to do? Taking food the local population needed, especially in Eastern Europe, where racist elements played a big role. Consequence was, of course, destruction. The other thing was taking the output of ongoing production that keeps the economy going, can even result in wartime investment. And actually, for instance, in my country, it resulted in the end of the war of a bigger industrial capacity than before the war. But because the investment was so important. But what's clear, what should be clear, there was no country where there was made a clear choice between those two possibilities. It everywhere was a mix, and to be clear, nowhere a balanced mix. The problem was that within Germany, the decision-making process was not clear. And when you don't have a clear, for instance, planning, what to do with a national economy, you can't make plans what to do with the local economies. When there are diverse authorities on the same topic working, the Ministry of Economics, Rijkswirtschaftsministerium, the Economic Office of the Wehrmacht, the Rijksministerium for Munition and War Production, and they all independently trying to get some of their ideas implemented. This will result in a very unbalanced mix in the occupied countries. There was also a conflict going on between the Berlin authorities and the local German authorities within the occupied countries. For instance, in Western Europe, those authorities had the duty to win the Germanic population of Norway or the Netherlands or Denmark for a future hand-in-hand with Germany. But the German authorities in Berlin, responsible for the economy, for the war economy, thought these are the richest countries of Europe. We can get a lot from them, and were trying to exploit them in a negative way. And as there was no Council of Ministers, as every normal country has, where you can discuss such thing and come to a compromise, you get a very strange mix. The difference within occupied Europe are quite substantial, and these were criteria, this resulting criteria to choose for a particular way of exploitation. For instance, the level of economic development within Europe was quite diverse. Western Europe, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, France were highly developed countries with highly developed economies. Eastern and especially Southeastern Europe were much less highly developed. For instance, Yugoslavia, the economic level of Yugoslavia was probably not much higher than some Asiatic countries. Nonetheless, these countries could be very important for some raw materials or food production. Then there was the military situation. In Western Europe, the war ended in June 1940. France was beaten and it was over. And before the invasion in Normandy, June 1944, there was more or less peace for 4 years. So you could produce, while in Eastern Europe, from 1941 on, there was permanent war going on, and a most destructive war, a terrible war. And then you had this Nazi racism. The ideas on the population, what they thought of the population was quite diverse. In Western population, in Western Europe, the population was considered Aryan. So high ranked, it's a hierarchy. It's not simply you are Jew or you are not Jew. There is really a hierarchy in Nazi Germany, according to Nazi opinions. And most of them were even considered Germanic brothers. That's to say, most countries, the population were considered Aryan brothers. France and the southern part of French-speaking part of Belgium was not. You could see that immediately after the start of the war. When the war was over in Western Europe, the Germanic countries, the POWs from the Germanic country were sent home. Those of France and the Walloon part of Belgium were used as forced laborers. And then south, the Jewish minorities. Yes, there were, of course, Jewish minorities in Western Europe. But that were very small minorities. Actually, only in the Netherlands it was more than 1%, 1.4%. Further, it were, and for instance, in the Netherlands they killed, murdered all Roma and Sinti. That were 32 people. That's of course a terrible crime, but on a population of 10 million, its impact on the economy is very limited, of course. In Southeastern and Eastern Europe, the people were considered inferior slaving peoples, and there were large Jewish and Gypsy minorities. Jewish minority of Poland was 10%. In Belarus cities, it was often a majority. So it was quite a different situation. Exploitation resulted in practice in a mix, and I said it already, seldom in a balanced mix. And that was caused by the rivalry within the Nazi top. Until 1942, Goering had played an enormous role, but his 4-year plan was called a plan organization, but had no national economic plan. when you don't have a national economic plan, you can't make plans for each of the occupied economies, and so it was not possible to say what you wanted from these countries. So when the war started, when the occupation started, in Western Europe, Göring just ordered to get all raw materials from these countries. Take it away. In France, there were even discussions whether they should not take all machinery as well, industrial machinery, and make it a high country producing food for Germany. Well, from August 1940 on, it became clear that Western Europe was simply too important, especially because they were thinking about attacking the Soviet Union. Then you need these highly developed economies, of course. To do that, you need a way to get out of these countries what you need without a central plan. And that happened by Auftragsverlagerung, transferring orders. German companies in Germany itself were, well, because it was a war economy, simply overcrowded with orders. They couldn't do the work. And now it was Seyss-Inquart, who was Reichscommissioner for the occupied Dutch territories, who got the idea, but the idea was also living in the economic department of the Wehrmacht, to transfer orders they could not cope with to the occupied countries. And that was a great success. Actually, in the Netherlands, in the first year of the occupation, it resulted in a badly managed Keynesian impulse to the Dutch economy of 14%. As a result, Seyss-Inquart could give, at the end of this year, end of 1940, the year the country lost its independence, say in an interview in the Volkische Beobachter, the Nazi newspaper, that he managed to do what the Dutch government didn't manage to do in 10 years' time. He solved the unemployment problem. And he was a little exaggerated, but he was not. It was not untrue. Actually, in the same year, profit of almost every country was higher in the year war was lost than it was since 1929. It resulted in a strong boom of the Dutch economy. And not only the Dutch economy, in Belgium and France you see the same. In Eastern Europe, plunder and destruction was central. And actually, when the Soviet Union was attacked, it was even the idea, let the Soviets destroy their own economy when they are withdrawing, this scorched policy, and let it burn, let it be destructed. In a few weeks' time, maybe it will take a few months, we have destroyed the Red Army, and then we need this country, and we need it empty, for it should be settled by Germanic farmers, and so we don't need all these Slavic inferiors living there. Actually, they needed was the food of these people to feed their soldiers. Only from 1942 on, when it became clear that the war was not won, that Germany was now actually fighting all major powers of the world, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. And so, even in Germany, there were some who thought, we can't win this war anymore. Only then, a more systematic planning was attempted. And Albert Speer, we know it all, got this order to do so. And he actually, for instance, raw materials were now planned by the Reichsstelle central organizations to organize the supply of raw materials, scarce raw materials within the Reich, but they also gave, from then on, orders to similar organizations within the occupied countries, and got their order from the Germans, from Speer's central planning. Well, there weren't strong elements of central planning, but there was a problem. at the same time, the labor hunting policy started. And that was done by another part of this Nazi hierarchy who couldn't cope, who didn't want Speer to be so powerful, who wanted another policy, especially the party. And at the same time, they attempted, because they knew that the war was not yet won in the Soviet Union, to start some production going on again in Eastern Europe, Poland, Soviet Union. Actually, never all production stopped. There was a warfare economy. When there is somewhere an army fighting, it needs food, it needs beer for its soldiers, it needs a pub, it needs a brothel, it needs office equipment for the officers, it needs, well, so that direct economic activity needed for the army is going on everywhere where there is an army fighting. But planned industrial activity to supply the German army, they only tried to restart from that period on. Now the question is, what did Germany actually take from occupied Europe? And actually the German historian Götz Ali recently wrote this book, Hitler's Volksstaat. I know that it's translated in English, but I don't know the title. He thought that 70% of the German war effort was paid by foreigners or Jews. And his conclusion is, well, the German population was not in favor of Hitler, but was bought by Hitler. The British historian Adam Too said, in Belgium, the Netherlands, and above all France, economic activity collapsed in 1940, never to recover. That means the economies collapsed completely. Nonetheless, Too thought that these countries contributed, occupied Europe contributed 25% to the German war effort. That is actually very little if you consider the fact that in 1938 the combined economies of the occupied countries, of the occupied territory, was 70% bigger than the German economy was. And that's a low guess. Oh, sorry. In Western Europe, there were 65 million inhabitants. And they had a GDP in 1938 in dollars of 1990, and that's this very complicated calculation made by Mark Harrison, of 302 billion dollar. That means that they had a share of the population of occupied Europe, later occupied Europe, for 23%, but they produced 38% of the economic activity. Central Europe was more or less even, but that's so small. That's especially Hungary and Czechoslovakia. But so well, Eastern and Southeastern Europe had a much lower production than would be the average if they had, if they compare it to their the number of people living there. The occupied economies were very diverse, and that's only what I want to say with that. That is seen also in this contribution they made. 78% of the total contribution until the end of 1944 to the German war effort, to the German war economy came from Western Europe. 4% of the protectorate. Altogether, occupied Europe supplied Germany with goods and services worth almost 94 billion Reichsmark. $94 billion Reichsmark, that was money taken to pay the bills. Germany had to pay for the goods and services they took in occupied Europe. So when they never just took money, apart from France for a certain period, but that was later used for goods and services anyway. So it's the strange thing in Nazi Germany when it occupied the country is that it didn't take money and then look what it could buy for it, but it took what it needed and then looked how it could finance it. It's the other way around. It was not included is confiscation without any payment. Well, actually, there are some calculations about it, and probably that was circa 1 billion. So that's billion Reichsmark again. So that's not a big difference. And the contribution of the occupied countries after the start of 1945, in 1945. Some countries were still occupied, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands. Well, actually, it's quite clear that it can't be so much for the simple reason you couldn't get out of these countries. There were no transport capacities anymore. The Reich was collapsing. It can't be so much. I'm sorry. The Wehrmachtsausgabe, the total expenditure of the German armed forces during the war was 414 billion Reichsmark. So the occupied Europe paid circa 22.6%, 23%. Labor not included, and nor was the contribution of non-occupied but dependent Europe. For instance, countries like Hungary, never occupied, well, in the end it was for a short period, but not occupied most of the time, but had to contribute. Italy, in quite another position, also contributed to the German war effort, and that's not included. When we try to include that, then the total is 118 billion Reichsmark, and then we get it's 28.6% of all war efforts. In general, in the highly developed countries, until 1942, taking the output of ongoing production was central. And that was in Western Europe, but also in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. That is what we should say now, call now the Czech Republic, without the border area that was Sudetenland, that was then inhabited with mainly ethnic German. That means something. That's an important conclusion that we can draw from this. For the Protectorate produced for the Germans. So it was not only racism. For, according to Hitler, in one of his, not only in one of his table speeches, but also in Mein Kampf, the Czech were as inferior as Poles or Russians or Belarusians. He ranked them among other slavics. And actually, in one of these table talks, he said that he should send them to the east, far away, get rid of them. At that moment, he needed them. They may be considered inferior, but their coal, their machinery they produced was not inferior at all, and they needed it very much, for they had a war to win. Elsewhere, it was quite different. For instance, in Poland in 1939, it was immediately a problem. After the war started, September 1939, that the Germans had this problem that they couldn't get people to get the crops in. So they started recruiting Poles for labor in Germany even before the first day of the war was over. And quickly they tried to stimulate Poles to go to Germany by lowering wages in Poland to a level you couldn't survive on, and to promise good wages when they went to Germany. Not very much later, they used already violence. From 1942 on, labor hunting, not immediately using violence, but labor hunting became normal practice all over occupied Europe. And that had an enormous destructive effect all over Europe. In the western part of Europe, they didn't want to go to Germany for obvious reasons, but also because it was the time that the first big bombardments of Germany started, and you could hear in the night. I heard these stories from the elder generation all my life. You could hear the planes, the Allied planes, in the night going over to Germany to bomb the country. So they knew quite well it is extremely dangerous to go to Germany. In the eastern part of Europe, people who went to Germany immediately after they were there, arrived there, sent letters how terrible they were. Well, it was terrible the situation was. So rumors about the terrible behavior against Poles or Russians or Belarusians were well known in these countries. The effect was that people went into hiding, and as far as I can calculate it, it's in every country more people went into hiding than actually arrived in Germany to work. That means that you need at least twice as much production from these people within Germany as you could realize in their home country. Maybe it was possible for some Poles, but it's impossible for a Frenchman or a Dutchman. The reason was that there were 2.5 million vacancies in Germany at that moment. And there was no one to fill them. Yes, there was actually. There were two groups who were capable to fill them. In the first month of the occupation of the war in the Soviet Union, through 3.2, some say 3.5 million prisoners of war were made. According to the Nazi authorities, it was irresponsible to get these Slavic inferiors with Bolshevist ideas on German soil. So they were simply not allowed to go to Germany to work there. Anyway, the war would be over in a few months, and then the army could be demobilized and its problem would be solved. Only a long time after it became clear that the war was not won so easily, they remembered these people they took prisoner of war during this first months of this occupation. And at that time, they were almost all destroyed already. Trying people to letting people trying people to let it survive without enough shelter, without enough food, without hygienic circumstances, and without medical care in a Russian winter is fatal. Millions died. A mortality rate of 2% a day in the camps, and you can imagine these were all young men. So even before they started to murder the Jews, that started in 1942, they already murdered so many Soviet POWs who could have been a solution for their own problem, that they did not have enough labor. Women. There were still an enormous amount of women in Germany not working. Actually, many more than Germany could ever get from occupied Europe. But there was serious objection among top Nazis, especially party fanatics, who wanted no German women working in factories. high-legged, long-legged Germanic women are not capable for factory work. It will undermine their psychological health, not to mention the fact that it could even undermine their capacity to bear a child. Well, you can't have that, of course, when you want to fight another war in the next generation. So they had to take them from the occupied countries. There they destroyed the labor markets. Many youngsters went into hiding. What are youngsters in hiding going to do? Well, some illegal production, of course, and further they become member of the resistance. Not all of them, by far not, but more than average. Altogether, occupied and otherwise dependent Europe paid 118 billion Reichsmark, 28% of all German expenditures. So Toos was right, not Ghazzani, but that's excluded forced labor. Some forced laborers, some families of forced laborers were paid, but that was an exception. And so most of the time it was not included. I go on. When you see the labor recruited in Western Europe, then there were in Europe and the whole of Europe, 5.9 million came from were civilians, 1.4 prisoners of war. Altogether, 7.3 million people were taken from Europe. In percent of the labor force of occupied Europe, that was 7.5%, more or less. For we don't know for sure, of course. For we say in the Soviet Union, the occupied part of the Soviet Union had 28 million inhabitants, but that was a never stabilized territory, so it's very hard to say exactly how many people live there. Anyway, it's clear that I could calculate from one country, the Netherlands, that was another project I did, exactly how many people were taken. For you simply know how many people lived, how many people were taken to Germany, how people should be registered in the labor market, and some disappeared in this period. So there we can say it's more than double. The other are more crude guesses, but more than 12% of the labor market people in the youngest laborers, the most recently trained or schooled laborers, so the best laborers, the strongest laborers disappeared. Especially because it were in Western Europe all men. The women that went from Western Europe were tiny minorities. The dark parts in these graphs are the women, and you can see that from Eastern Europe, Poland and the Soviet Union, a substantial part of women came, but from the rest of Europe it were tiny minorities. Most of them were National Socialist sympathizers. The total value of the booty then becomes, if you include 27 billion Reichsmark for labor, that's simply the number of years they worked there and the wages paid for normal German laborers in the same categories, and then you get this sum. So all together, 35% of the German war expenditures were paid by occupied Europe. Altogether, that seems that being occupied is cheap. Being occupied was cheaper than fight a war. The war-going countries actually, the belligerents paid more for their warfare than the occupied countries. That's the impression you get. Even in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, however, the best, the most well-treated countries of occupied Europe, the economic production declined during the war. While all over all belligerents, apart from the Soviet Union, production increased. In fact, in the end, we can conclude that when you calculate what was left over of the production for consumption as a percent of 1938, the occupied countries were worse off than the countries, the belligerent countries. To get a realistic production impression of the consequence, you need to know the production. And that's not so easy. For what we have to realize is that in all occupied countries there grew substantial black markets and clandestine production. There was labor in hiding, there were raw materials available, there were all reasons to produce clandestine. If not for patriotic reason, and most of the time the patriotic argument is doubtful, then for economic reasons. Clandestine prices were frozen, markets were regulated, people were not allowed to change job, and all that were reasons to do it illegally, clandestine. When we don't include the black market, we are to not just guess too low production, but we also the decline is too fast, and the increase after the war, the post-war growth, is also too fast again. For then illegal production becomes legal again. A famous American economic historian calculated that in a half a year, German production in 1948 grew by 50%. Impossible, of course. What's in fact happened was that illegal production was registered again, and then you get a different situation. We will see that what we always knew of this German Wirtschaftswunder, this miracle, economic miracle, was no miracle at all. We have the same stories in the Netherlands and in all kinds, but was just a statistical error. I will first show you some Dutch figures, statistics. For a simple reason, I made a complete new calculation for another project of all Dutch national accounts. And that without using any official statistics. In a small country as the Netherlands, that's possible. It's impossible in a country like France, not to speak of the United States. Why not using official statistics? Because all kind of companies, all kind of businessmen had very good reason not to give good information anymore to the official statistics. You didn't want to know that time government that there was still capacity not used for German war production, but for other productions, illegal production or legal production, but not used in the way they wanted it. Or you didn't want to know the post-war government, the government that would come back, that you produce so much for the Germans. All kind of reasons not to give the information you want. Actually, the Dutch Statistical Office said itself so in a report before the end of the war, we don't have the good information anymore. I calculate the Dutch industrial productivity, 1 million of guilders 1938, and the blue line is the total production, the light blue line is the legal production. And you'll see that in 1944 and 1945 there is a difference of 10 and 20%. The same is true of the agrarian production, that's even more spectacular. The decline in agrarian production is not a real decline. That's to say, it's an economic decline in money value, but probably not in caloric how do you say that in English? Caloric value, because they produced less animal product and more vegetable products. That was ordered by the government, otherwise they could not feed the people all the people without imports. So probably decline was very limited. When we take the real GDP calculated by Agnes Madison, and by me for the Netherlands, the clandestine production not included, then we have only one non-Western country, and that's a serious problem. The only non-Western country, non-Western European country we have information about is Greece. There was no Poland anymore. Poland fell apart in a number of parts, and what we call occupied Poland most of the time is the general government, and the general government was only a third of pre-war Poland, and it's not even completely Poland now. Part of it is now, I think, Belarus. So that's very difficult to say, and the same is true for Czechoslovakia, for Yugoslavia, for nobody ever calculated the national account of Ostland, what was an occupied territory in the Soviet Union. So we only have for Greece some information. And what you can see then is that the production declined with 20% in most Western countries. Only the Netherlands in 1944, 1945, a little more. But that's when half the country was occupied, half liberated. The still occupied part, the economically most important part, with all cities isolated, a serious famine going on. That's extreme situation. France is also, when the war was starting in 1944, 1945, seriously damaged. I need 10. I need 10. I need 10.
7.
No, I can't. Here you see the decline of the economy according to my calculation and according to the old statistic, then minus what the Germans took. Well, actually, the production was still on a high level, but when you take off what the Germans took, the decline is still very seriously. When you take the official statistics, it's clear that's simply not possible. The Dutch couldn't have survived. Actually, the population grew during the war on, at the deepest point, less than 20% of their pre-war consumption levels. So, when we want to calculate, make a guess, an educated guess of black market production, clandestine production in other countries, there are a number of criteria. The share of each sector. In agriculture, it's much easier to produce clandestine, and in industries where you use local raw materials, much easier than when you need raw material bought on the market that could be controlled. Well, when was the country occupied and when liberated again? Were there serious shortages? Was there even a famine going on? Was market regulation more or less accepted in the country or not? And we all took these criteria and then we made a guess of the clandestine production. And you can see that it's in a country like France, 26%, rather high. In all other Western countries, apart from the Netherlands in 1944, that's famine. It was less than 20%. And the same is true in Czechoslovakia. In the highly agrarian Eastern European countries with millions of smallholders, who you can never control, who are never always producing for themselves and their neighbors and their family in town, you have much higher shares, of course. Well, this is an index of the real GDP without clandestine production. You can see that France and Greece are worst off, especially Greece. And the problem in Greece is also that it doesn't recover very quickly after the war. Now we know, of course, that after the war, Greece had a very terrible period with a civil war going on, etc. But nonetheless, it's not only that. Here we see the real GDP, including an educated guess of clandestine production. And again, Greece is, notwithstanding the fact that we made an educated guess of the clandestine production, the production still declined with 50%. That's dramatic, especially when the population, the Germans, took enormous amounts of food from Greece for the simple reason that it was directly behind the front. You can't imagine that probably, but it's directly behind the North African front, where General Rommel was fighting the British General Montgomery. So in the rest of Europe, it's less dramatic, apart from France again. France was seriously damaged. What went wrong in France? France is a country without enough coal and without enough transport capacity at that moment. In Germany, there were discussions going. Shouldn't we send coal and railway equipment to France? But nobody well, this regime was a regime of boasters. Get everything from these countries. That kind of language. When you can't make good, argumented calculations, say this is what we should do, nobody is interested in this country. So it was impossible to send coal that was scarce in Germany itself to France. And for that reason, France could not produce as much as the Germans hoped for. And for that reason, they took more food from France than it could miss. In France, there was a permanent, not famine, but a lack of food, especially in the more urbanized parts. And they took more labor from France than from other occupied countries, Western countries. Well, this seems, when you see this, including the black market production, of course it's dramatic what happened in Greece, but it doesn't seem so dramatic as we just said. But this is, in this graph, everything is in only the production, not when we make a guess of what was taken from these countries. For time reason, I will. This is the graph that shows what's still available for local use after the occupier took its share, or what it thought it was its share. Now, Greece and France are not only worse off, not even worse off at the deepest point, but in the long run, they don't recover quickly. The situation becomes clearer when we don't take 1938 as an average, but an unweighted average of the production of these countries in 1938. And then you can see that Greece, that was not really a poor country compared with Poland or Yugoslavia or the occupied part of Russia, is extremely worse off compared to the other occupied countries. The differences were enormously. I will leave this. And, well, in Western Europe, actually, when you cooperate and when you don't make a big fuss of this war and just accepted the situation, and what could you do else? Life went on. Most of the people in Western Europe, well, more or less had a normal life. It was not nice, the situation. They missed their luxuries. They missed their democratic system. They missed their queen or king. They missed their, all these their trade unions. Of course they missed it, but life went on, closed the curtains, and then it's not nice to have no egg for breakfast anymore, and that the beer is so thin nowadays. But that's an argument for grumbling, not for partisan activity or something like that. In Eastern Europe, cooperation was no option. The posters say, together we will win. But why would you be, as an Eastern European, cooperative to this regime? It took your food. It took your people. It was so cruel that even when it needed labor, they wanted men and women. When women were pregnant, they unpregnanted her to make her available as labor. These were the practices over there. So terror existed. Resistance was a danger, but it was hardly a bigger danger than accepting the situation. The same was true in the Balkan, and there was resistance resulted in terror. Terror simply shooting everything in the village when there was suspicion of activity of partisans. The result was that a substantial part of the economy fell in the hand of partisans. Whether these partisans were completely spontaneous or organized by the Communist Party, by the Red Army, that doesn't matter. People were available to do that kind of jobs. The Germans took their foods. That was the reason. And there was racism. In these countries, people who did not do any work needed by the Germans simply did not get any food, got no rations. The term was useless eater. There was a difference made between those entitled to rations and others. And in Western Europe it was simply everybody was entitled to rations. The Germans make in the Netherlands they said to the organizers of the food distribution, why do you give such good rations to the Jews? And they said, every man, woman is the same for the ration system. And that was the end of this discussion. In Eastern Europe, here you see a map we found in the archive Sergei talks about. You should see in the north is the Baltic Sea, in the south the Crimea and the Black Sea. So this is the total Soviet Union from north to south, altogether 1,600 kilometers, 1,000 miles. And the red districts are completely, the economy is completely distracted by partisans, it says. Well, actually, it was in the hand of partisans. They were producing, but that is an enormous territory, almost the entire Ukraine, substantial part of Ostland. And the pink territories were, the main part was in hand of partisans. In the West and Central Europe, the highly developed economies were relatively quiet. In the Balkan and Eastern Europe, low productive economies, war areas, and hinterland of the front lines. And these were terribly, the behavior of the Germans was terrible. Western Europe and the Czech Protectorate, and that's important, including the Czech Protectorate. So it was not only racism, there was a more or less civilized behavior. Actually, when the Czechs did not get enough food anymore, butter was sent from butter. The most expensive, the most rare food stuff was sent from Denmark to this territory. It was advantageous to the occupier to keep the economy going. In Eastern Europe, everyone was immediate needed at the front. Economies were not interesting, and racism was not checked, and the situation was, well, characterized by terror. I think I have said what's most important.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both presenters. It's a fascinating, sophisticated discussion of, and I think obviously a great contribution to understanding the history of occupied Europe during World War II. So we have some time for question, discussion. Please wait for the microphone and identify yourself if you would. Here in front.
I'm Stephen Sage, and I work at the Holocaust Museum. And my question concerns an often overlooked entity within the Nazi German economic conglomerate. And this was the Organisation Todt. Would you address the role of the Organisation Todt within the contradictions you mentioned between plunder and economic integration?
Well, the Organisation Todt was the organization that in the 30s built the Autobahn in Germany and afterwards was responsible for most fortifications. So it was very important in a number of countries. Russia, in Norway, and in Greece, actually, where it built a lot of military buildings. It's in this book not there's no chapter on the Organisation Todt. Actually, it's then and when is discussed more or less, but it's not a topic. No, it's actually there are some Norwegian historians at the moment doing a lot of research on this Organisation Todt, but I think it's such an enormous topic that you need a book for it itself and a complete separate research project for it itself. It's very complicated and difficult. It was also active in some territories on the Atlantic Wall, and I mention it for the laborers of the Organisation Todt were allowed to cross border from Belgium to the Netherlands and from Belgium to France all the time, and they were very influential in smuggling. But no, it's not a topic that's central in this book. I'm sorry.
Please, here in front. I need the microphone again. Right here in front.
I'm Tim Saxon from Liberty University. I have written on the German occupation of Italy and its exploitation of the Italian war economy, and I found it interesting that you had to some degree, exclude Italy. What sparked my interest in this topic was a discussion in Hitler's talks, military records, with Speer in '44, where he's trying to get the Italians to be punished for striking again, God forbid. And Speer says, can't do that. We can't shoot one out of every 10 of the strikers because they're providing 25% of our war production. This is September of '44. Did you measure into the impact? I mean, for instance, when the Germans take over Italy in '43, there should be a boost in their economy because they found millions of tons of raw materials stockpiled by Italians, producers who were going to jump back into consumer production at the end of the war. And the Germans spent the rest of the war sending what would have been empty trains back filled with raw materials to factories all over Europe. Did you come across anything that showed a boost in war production from that in the occupied countries or anything?
No, I didn't see any change in the war production in the occupied countries from the change of position of Italy, apart from the fact that in the Balkan, in mining districts in the Balkan, they at once had enough laborers for Italian POWs as well as forced laborers from Italy were used in the mines. And it was simply a new source of forced labor.
After the war, they asked the Russians how they'd been treated, and they said, oh, it wasn't as bad as the Italians were. They actually felt sympathy for the Italians.
That's an interesting topic you mentioned. Well, it's not in the book, but actually there was an enormous difference, there's not much about in the book, but between how you were treated as forced laborer according to your race rank. Jews were murdered, Poles and Soviet people were very badly treated, but for instance there was a Dutch baker who got less paid than German bakers and went to a German court and was set right. He got the same, for he was a Germanic brother and should be treated as such. Yeah?
Don?
I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. I guess my question is more a point of information, something I don't know, and that is if the Allies understood that the Nazis were using the occupied territories to fuel the Nazi war machine, to what extent did the Allies target any of this, or was it completely hands-off? Were there bombings strictly within Germany, or did they look at infrastructure, industrial facilities, transportation, and so on in some of the occupied territories to cut off the supply lines?
Well, that's a very interesting point. Actually, there were some bombardments on main factories in all occupied countries. But nonetheless, for instance, the Bohemia, Moravia, the important industrial production of that territory became more and more important after the 1944 bombardment systematically bombed down German cities there they didn't had these bombardments. So there were, when they knew this is a very important strategic factory, well, they would bomb it down in an occupied country. But what they didn't do was simply bombing down a town. Apart from the Americans in the end of the war, when they didn't know exactly in the border areas between Belgium and Germany and the Netherlands and Germany, whether it was a Dutch or a German city, and they bombed down a few Dutch cities and a Belgium city by mistake. But that can happen when you make such a mess of it. Yeah.
Well, there was also a British blockade, and British were very proud of it. Very proud of it. But in fact, I mean, if you look at the Nazi economic files, it had a very limited impact on their economic activity. Of course, you had less coffee, less tea, less chocolate. But, I mean, from a macroeconomic point of view, it had little impact on the war itself. So...
Here, let's see, here's another question in the middle. We need the microphone. This gentleman here. Yeah.
Thank you. Abraham Avidor, retired Foreign Service. Yeah, I'd like to mention, first of all, for the sake of completion, that the most bombed target, Allied target in the Second World War was Ploiești, near Bucharest. And that leads me to ask you about, which is a major supplier of oil, which leads me to ask you about the importance of oil in running the German military economy, the Luftwaffe, the Panzer, the militarized, the mechanized infantry, and so on. They needed oil like oxygen, and later on in the war, the Battle of the Bulge was impeded. The Germans were not able to get enough oil to continue with their... so anyway, could you please comment on the importance of oil and where they got it during the war?
Yes, I can say a little about it, but first, before I will do that, I want to emphasize that this project was not on the German economy. It was a project on the economies of occupied Europe and how they were exploited. And that's quite another topic. What I know of the German, fuel was a problem all the time. It was not only oil, coal, all fuel, even peat was scarce. It was actually the production of oil and I don't know the English word, ersatz, substitutes, made from coal was not enough to build all the planes Germany actually needed, was not enough to use the high sea marine navy as it for they simply lacked coal. Transport was also all the time a serious problem, and what I want to make clear by this is that what Germany tried to do was fighting the three major powers of the world, while you are yourself only a middle-sized economy. And then you need all these, you can try to involve all these countries you conquered, but it's simply not enough. They didn't have the capacity, and actually when we had this terrible quarrel of Tots, the same Todt, with Hitler in February 1942, when Todt made clear the war is lost, the production of tanks by the Soviet Union is bigger than we have. The production of aircraft by the British is bigger than we can produce them. And then we didn't even calculate the American, and so look for a compromise. Hitler was right when he said it's too late for a compromise. But anyway, the war was lost at that moment already. And at least some, and Nazi Germany knew it.
Yeah, it's also very visible from Nazi economic files nowadays that you see how economic calculations influence decision-making process on the highest level. You know that historians had a lot of debate why Hitler, say in summer 1941, in July, suddenly decided to go to the southern Ukraine, not directly to Moscow. And everybody, I mean, many people wrote that it was so easy to catch it. But now we understand that the reasons were purely economical. Resources, raw materials, and oil. And his advance to Caucasus was also a very practical one. Oil, resources. So, and now we understand it much better.
But even when they would have conquered the Caucasus and would have started the production, they would not have enough.
It was not enough.
If they would ever get it to Germany.
Yeah. Moreover, Russians were ready to blow it up, with the help of the British, by the way.
We have a question here in front. Once again, the microphone. Thank you. Please.
I thought that your graphs detailing...
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. First things first, Michael Olson, unaffiliated at the moment. I thought your graphs were very interesting, that detailed clandestine versus above the board economic activity, especially people going more underground once Nazi Germany had been there a while. I was curious, how did you factor in some of the intangible stuff? Like, I can imagine a factory worker working in the United States thinking so much depended on their work, putting in the extra hour, putting in extra concentration, whereas like a forced laborer who didn't believe in what they're working for, I kind of think of Schindler's List, you know, like sandbagging it, sabotaging. Like, is there a way to factor that in, or did people try to factor that in?
I couldn't really calculate it in, but it's a known fact that at the end of the Arbeitseinsatz program, the labor recruiting program, Fritz Saukel, who was responsible for this and was hanged for it in Nuremberg, said we have 7 million foreign laborers who wished and 20,000 volunteers. So it's completely clear that these poor people were working against their will. And because they were there against their will, but they were not even interested to get the job where they were trained for. Where even the administration was not so that they could get a trained industrial laborer from France in a job as a trained industrial laborer. That's, well, of course, the productivity was low, and it was, from an economic point of view, view, an absolute failure to get these people from the occupied countries. But this regime was not rational. It was this. Somebody starts screaming, "It's irresponsible to use women. So we have to get these people from somewhere else." And then the Saukos started to scream, "We have to take him from the, and we should do it ruthlessly." Ruthlessly is always a good argument, it seems, in this. And then they simply started to get people and have this project. We want 250,000 laborers from France, 60% trained labor before the end of the year. And that worked one time. And the next time for everybody is don't know how to react to it. And then the next program, everybody, many start to go in hiding. And the third program, it's impossible to get anybody anymore. That's how it worked.
So if the Third Reich wasn't racist and if it wasn't sexist, it might have had a chance. Or no?
Well, it's an endless discussion. I mean, it's a what if? I mean, you never know. I mean, but if you look at the minds of those people, I mean, it was always. I mean, the racist ideas were always present, and you can't change it. I mean, they always try to change their policy in Ukraine, in Belarus, with Russians. And I mean, if you look at their files, discussions. And what is interesting, that every high German believed that he knew how it should be organized. And eventually everything collapsed because ideas changed, time changed. But I mean, they wanted to these people were working for them, but at the same time they would like to have no resistance. And I mean, and it looks that initially, if you say if, then why the war? I mean, you've got trade.
Actually,
that's the point.
During the period that they traded with the Soviet Union, they got more from the Soviet Union than during the period.
That's the point. Yes, with the trade with trade with the Soviet Union, they get much more than as a result of the war. That's clear now.
Where those documents are going to be put up on the web? What agency is going to be putting those up in Moscow?
Yeah.
Well, it's
Maybe you should repeat it.
It will be a big project sponsored by. The question is that we've got a big portion of German documents entirely unknown for academic public. And these are documents of the highest importance. They were brought by the Red Army to Moscow. And in time of Stalin, the entire German archive, all captured German archives, were split into two big parts. One was a sort of special archive, which was run by NKVD. And then now it's a state archive in Moscow, a Russian state military archive. And all files are available. You can go and read them. But the other part was top secret. It was the part of the Russian Defense Ministry. So for some reason, I mean, we don't know why exactly, but they kept a big portion of German documents inside the Russian files, inside the Russian archive of the Defense Ministry. And now we organize that it's many documents are actually missing documents from other parts of German archives. For example, you know that Germans published the Dienstkalender Himmlers, this working diary of Himmler, and we thought that the other years were missing, 43, 44, and now we found them in Moscow, so we can easily publish them. I mean, that's great, and the decision is, I mean, it would take a lot of time to physically remove this document from one archive to another archive, probably 10 or more years, because they're pretty fragile. So the idea is to use these modern sophisticated technologies, scanning it from, using high resolution scanners and put it on the web. So the entire project would be sponsored by the German government, and I think in the year 2015, I think they are going to organize a big site together with the Russians, of course, with the Russian Federal Agency for Archives and with the Russian Defense Ministry. I think this treaty would be signed next week in Moscow, and probably in 3 years' time you will have all these documents being digitalized and available on the web. I don't think that they all will be higher resolution images, but all images will be there, so you can easily use and read them. And there are very interesting files: Wehrmacht, SS, Reichskanzlei, all sorts of ministeriums. So it's
actually, I had one file sent to me by you, and it's amazing. I wrote already a book on the Dutch economy during the Second World War, and there was actually in September 1944, when the southern part of the country was liberated, some part of the German occupiers went home, and they wrote a final report on what they took from the Netherlands, and it's there in Moscow. It's nowhere in the Netherlands, but it's there in Moscow. Well, that's the great stuff, of course, when you are interested in it.
We're just about at the end of our time. I think we have time for one more question, sir.
My name is Leendert Solleveld. I'm a World Bank retiree. I have a question maybe outside the scope of the book, but I was just wondering, how did the Germans finance the build-up of their army prior to 1940? It was not a very wealthy country. It was an economic crisis, I think, in the 30s. But how do they finance the establishment of that enormous war apparatus trying to conquer the rest of Europe?
Germany was not very rich, but Germany was not a real poor country, and actually wages were low, and wages in Germany didn't reach pre-depression levels before 1941 or something like that. So they kept the and they were completely isolated by an inconvertible currency. And so when you stimulate the economy by governmental spending, it stays in the economy. And that had strong effects. You know, it was not such a poor country. Anyway, they produced a big army, but the army was not that enormous before 1941, I think. There were 4 million Germans under arms in 1940. That's quite substantial, but the population was something like 70 million, so it's not an enormous army.
We've had I think, a fascinating discussion. We could continue, but our time is up. Please join me in thanking our presenters, and hope to see you again.